So guys, we will now move to the discussion where we said that a variable can be defined inside a function. Yes, of course, we can define a variable inside a function. But a function is also a variable. So I can also write a function can be defined inside a function. So here we are, where we say a variable can be defined inside a function, but because a function is also a variable, so a function can be defined inside a function. And a function that is defined inside a function, what do we call it? We call it inner function. So function that is defined inside a function, we call it inner function. So any function that is defined inside a function is called inner function. All right. So this is what we are going to do now in the program. So let's start now. Let's define a function. And let us say function say hello, which is a simple function. And it just alerts, or maybe in the console, it just says hello. Now, inside this function, I can also define another function. Let us say function greet. And again, I can write console.log. It's afternoon time here, so I can write good afternoon. So what do you see here? We see here that there is a function defined outside, and there is also a function which can be defined inside. And we can do this because JavaScript treats functions as plain variables. Next thing, if the function is defined, can I call it? The answer is yes. So I can just call it inside the function. Keep in mind, I can only call this function inside the function. Why? Because I have defined this function inside the say hello function, which means the scope of this greet function or variable is only within the say hello function. So inside here, I can definitely call the function greet. So again, discussing about scope. Scope means till where the variable exists. And our particular variable greet exists within the say hello function. Outside the say hello function, it is not available because it is a variable, and we know that any variable that we define inside a function can only be used inside that particular function. So a function that is defined inside a function can only be used within that function. So the next thing, let us try to run this piece of code. I'm going to call say hello function, which will declare a greet function, and will be calling the greet function. Let's try to run this piece of code and see the output. Let me open my console and run it again. And you can see that this hello is coming from line number 11. And this good afternoon is coming from this line number 13 inside the greet function. Very simple. So what is the conclusion? Conclusion is that we can define functions inside a function without any problem, and those functions are only available within the function boundary. Outside that, we cannot access them. So in the same example, if I try to write this piece of code here, and after the say hello function, I try to call the greet function, then the program should throw error. Let's reload again. The line number 11 and 13 ran, but you can see on line number 18, we got an error, and the error is uncaught reference error. Greet is not defined because greet is only available within the boundary of the function say hello. Now, I can define as many functions as I want, which means if I want, I can define more functions also. So coming back here again, I can also define one more function. Let us say function say good evening and console.log good evening. So I have now defined two functions, and there is no limit how many functions I can define within a function. Again, I can call the function inside the function only. Save it. And if I try to run this piece of code again, we should be able to get the output of all the 3 lines. Let's open the console. And here you can see we have the output. This is inside the main function, inside the greet function, inside the good evening function. Well, this error is because I'm also trying to call greet. So I'm just going to remove that piece of code and run it again, and it works fine. So that is all. Now, another thing is that we can define function like a normal function way. We can also define like a function expression, which means instead of writing function greet and function good evening, I can write here like this, like a regular variable, const greet equal to function. And same thing here. Const say good evening equal to function. So this probably looks a little bit more simpler because now we can see that the functions are declared like variables, but both are the same. And this program is again going to work. Correct? We can see the output. So that is what is an inner function. And as I said, inner function can only be accessed within the function. So now, guys, coming back to the next discussion, which is a variable, of course, can be passed to a function in the form of a parameter. And we know that function is also a type of variable. So we can conclude that a function can also be passed to a function. And that is what we are going to do now. So let's again come back. And we have the same example where we were defining inner functions. Instead of inner functions, we can now just define this function outside and then I can pass this function as a parameter to the say hello function. So what I'm doing, I'm defining a function outside with the name greet, and I'm passing the greet function to the say hello function. Again, how to use it? Very simple. We can just call the function greet with the same variable that we receive as a parameter to the say hello function, which means we can also pass functions to a function. You can see here, I have a function defined with the name greet, and this function is passed here to the say hello, which means it is the same function that is then passed to the say hello function here, which means this greet is the same function which we have defined here, and we can call it normally. So having said that, now let us try to run this piece of code. And as you can see here, the function is getting called properly. This is the hello. And after that, we are calling the greet function. Greet function again runs the line console.log, which is visible here. So concluding, we can also pass functions to functions, and we can pass as many functions as we want. Let us try to now see that again. We defined one more function, which was say good evening. So instead of one greet function, I can pass both the greet and the say good evening function, and I can receive the parameters here, and then I can call them. And if we try to run this again, we can see first the say hello function runs, the console.log, then the greet function is called, which calls the console.log good afternoon. Then we call the say good evening function, which calls the console.log good evening. So this is the arrow diagram where the console is coming from. And when we call the greet function, the greet function calls this greet function. When we call the good evening function, this calls this function here. And that is how we can pass functions to functions. Again, based on the same fundamental that functions are variables and they behave like variables in JavaScript. Now, we are today looking at the same example of inner function and trying to understand one new fundamental, which is returning variable from a function we already know, but we can also apply that to a function, which means we can return a function from a function. Again, because functions are treated as normal variables in JavaScript. So going back, let us now try to make a program on this. So this is my previous function of inner function. I have defined a function greet inside. So instead of calling the greet, I am going to now return this function. So I will write here return greet, which means instead of returning a normal variable, I am now returning a function. And we know functions are also variables. So if we are returning a value, which means we will write here let return value function equal to say hello. I'm giving it just a variable name with the name return value function because I'm going to get a value returned from this say hello function. And this particular return value is actually the same as this greet function. It is the same, keep in mind. Which means I can again call it return value function, and here I'm calling it. Before calling, I'm just going to write console.log calling greet function. Now calling return greet function because it is returned again from this say hello function. Now, let us try to run this piece of code and see the output. All right. Let me write a console.log here also. Let's now try to reload. And here is it. You can see first it is executing the say hello function. Then it comes to the line console.log inside say hello function, which we can see from the arrow diagram here. Then it is coming here, calling return greet function, and then finally the main line is executed, which is good afternoon inside greet function, which is here. I will just draw the arrows again so that you can do the comparison of the program flow. First, and this line, finally, this line. So that is how we can also return a function from a function.